Kia ora and welcome to this webinar where we will hear from Dieu. Julie's a geomorphologist with the company Rayonier, the forestry company Rayonier up in the Pacific Northwest. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marine Visser. I look after the forest engineering program here at the School of Forestry, and I'll be hosting this particular webinar. I've also had the privilege and pleasure of hosting Julie here for the last week and a half. And prior to that, we were able to spend a little bit of time on some field visits up in the Gisborne Napier area. And she's also been able to visit some sites here in Canterbury as well. So apart from giving us this insight into her understanding of steep, unstable slopes and the best ways to manage them. Based on her experience here, towards the end of her presentation, she'll also provide some thoughts as to how we are approaching the management of our steep terrain. So without any further ado, enjoy the webinar. Thanks.
Through 1992, there were sort of incremental rule changes. In 92 was a pretty substantial rule package with buffers extending up into smaller fish waters, wetland protections. And there was still a lot of really unresolved issues at that point. So people were concerned about landslides. They were concerned about channel migration. They were concerned about road erosion, but they didn't really know what to do with these things. And so we said, okay, we'll write this process called Watershed Analysis. The federal government actually had their own. We wrote one within the state. They were fairly compatible. We started evaluating, where are landslides coming from? Where are they going to? What are they impacting? Same with road erosion, just the health of the riparian buffers. And this was all linked to the water and the fish at the bottom of the hill. And we got about a third of the Western Washington industrial timberlands covered with at least the science part of watershed analysis. We sure learned a lot in the process. So I'll talk some about how that related to the rules that came out of it. Coming into 1998, 1999, it hit the point where the Endangered Species Act and the federal government was looking at listing some of the salmon stocks as threatened and endangered. And that's a big deal because if you accidentally kill a threatened or endangered species, there are ramifications, right? I mean, actually legal ramifications. And so people started working on what are called habitat conservation plans. Several of the smaller landowners in Washington state went into a habitat conservation plan by themselves. And then in 99, the timber industry as a whole said, no, we think we want kind of more universal protection. We want timberland in Washington state under one big umbrella habitat conservation plan. And that led to actually 3 years of negotiations, which are widely called the forest and fish negotiations. I participated in a lot of the topic-specific subgroups underneath that, rarely at the big negotiating table and then just as an observer. But some really focused topics like what are we going to protect as unstable slopes to limit landslide rates came from the committee, and that negotiating body went rubber stamped because they didn't have the expertise. I think they were largely foresters at the time. And so from about 2001 up to present day, and this will go forward at least 30 years, and I think there's 2 renewals for 40 and 50 years. We are under the Forest and Fish Habitat Conservation Plan with a take permit in case we accidentally kill a fish. We're leaving a lot of protections that all circle around fish. And then we've also got an adaptive management program. So this is sort of these steps underneath the board. There's policy level, there's a master science body, and then there's little offshoots that are topic specific that are actually doing research. And a lot of the research has to do with how are our forest practices performing today? Are they doing what we predicted they would do to protect the environment? Where do I have to point the pointer? At the screen?
No, here.
Here, okay. No, not cooperating. You okay? I'll just tell you. So hill slope landslides. This shouldn't really be a big surprise, but basically, if there's a big hole in the ground, some sort of a concave landform or a gully, there's a whole lot of dirt missing. It's exactly where we're going to expect landslides in the future. So we call them inner gorges, you call them gullies, but this is what we really expect. And it's what we expect from something like harvest, because harvest is very similar to a natural disturbance, right? You have a fire, you have a windstorm, you have a harvest, you've lost rooting strength. You get an acceleration of landslides in those locations. Next slide, please. We recognize kind of two broad flavors of inner gorges. They're just defined as, you know, sort of that last slope down to the stream. It's got to be at least 70% to count as an inner gorge. We've got big hill slope inner gorges or gullies, and then we've got little side slope ones. Next slide. It's working now. Okay, excellent. So, and no big surprise here. This is a small gully near Napier. Large gully near Gisborne, the Forest Enterprises showed us. And you can see sort of the lower edge of that unplanted surface and all of the failures along it. And we could all kind of see sort of right at the timber line or just over the edge, some distinct place on the ground where there's a break and slope. The ground gets a little better, a little over gradient, and that's just the top of the inner gorge. We also recognize the landform that we call bedrock hollows. It's the idea that in steep ground, very top of some of those hill slope inner gorges, you've got sort of a spoon-shaped landform. And if the axis is 70%, they're filled in, they preferentially fill in with soil. The next storm can make them wetter than they've been in previous storms, and then you can trigger a big event out of them that goes right down that confinement called the hill slope inner gorge.
When you say the axis is 70%, what do you mean?
Like the sort of the center axis, 70+% in the middle of the feature. Because you expect the failure to actually happen sort of down here in the throat.
Okay.
And what we've come to understand about these features is that they are fundamentally created by repeated landslide processes. And with time, they grow up towards the ridge top, they get wider, and they also get deeper into the hill. So they change character as thousands of years go by. And actually, Washington's a great place to sort of see that progress because of the reset from the glaciations that have come through. We also recognized that a fair number of landslides are coming from roads or landings. Those would be the set that initiate from or just below one of the features. You're either still in the fill prism, or in some cases you've just concentrated water, and what takes off is maybe, you know, 30 meters below the road surface. Shouldn't be any big surprise that a lot of these occur where the roads are crossing one of these unstable landforms, right? I mean, gee, we've added even more dirt and we've concentrated water, and a naturally unstable landform fails. But roads are a pretty big stick across a lot of at least the Washington and Oregon landscape, that we get failures, pretty big failures sometimes, that can route down into the channel network in places that we would otherwise not define as a naturally unstable slope. Now, 23, 24 years ago, we're writing this rule package. We know what we know from Watershed Analysis, right? We're running on USGS topo sheets. Our GIS is running on 30 meter or 10 meter DEM, which, oh, by the way, are derived by averaging those USGS topo sheets. And we had the very, very first LiDAR. I mean, Rayonier had a tiny bit of LiDAR from O2, and it was not very helpful. Slightly better than the USGS topo sheet. So we were able to really characterize these landforms in written narrative and provide photos of individual places. We had these watershed analyses that told us that this is where the big landslides that delivered to the channel network were coming from. But we still couldn't map them very well, right? They weren't very well mapped in the watersheds that we had done mapping in. There were a lot that were missed, and there were a lot of conservative mapping that sort of overmapped that 70% because, you know, maybe that hollow thing is too steep. We did our best. So what you see in this figure, first off, it's hypothetical data, but it's actually not that far from true. Is that hollows are contributing a fairly small percentage of the landslides. And then inner gorges are contributing quite a few of the total landslides. And you've got that big gray spike up to almost 60% from planar hill slopes, right? But if you then look at just the delivering landslides, which ones actually made it into the channel network? Well, you've still got the hollow signature. Not a big surprise. Most intergorge landslides, they're right above the stream. They're in the stream, deliver. And you don't see very many of those planar landslides delivering to a waterway. And then if you look at sort of the total volume that's involved with the landslide, bedrock hollows are the big actor. Those failures started high up on the hill. They ran the whole way down the hill. They entrained material en route, and sometimes at sort of astonishing rates of entrainment. We've got numbers from careful studies in Oregon that are anywhere from 7 to 30 cubic yards of material entrained out of those inner gorges per lineal yard of travel. So that's a big cross section of dirt right out of that gully as they travel down the hill. And then if you actually look at sort of the delivered volume down into the channel network, all of a sudden bedrock hollows are your big actors. Those gullies, just the sides by themselves where it wasn't involved in a bedrock hollow initiation, are delivering, but somewhat less. And you hardly see the planar slope signature, right? This is really good news, because if what you're trying to manage is delivery of either sediment or wood down into your channel network, you focus the problem into a specific part of the landslide, a specific part of the landscape. You're going to have to point to that highest big landslide here.
Yep.
Okay, so this is on Wednesday's field trip in the Gisborne area. And I was asked at this stop, you know, sort of what I thought I was seeing. And I said, well, that's the one that worries me. The top of that is one of these bedrock hollow features. And you see a big debris flow trucking right down the middle. And you see actually that it's triggering small failures from along the edges. The rest of that, a lot of the rest of that, you've got some little slips on convex slopes. You've got some little slips on even quite steep planar slopes. A lot of those didn't turn into something big, right? They didn't deliver to the channel network at all. They look terrible, you know, if you're just standing going, eek. But, and so that's why I beg the question, you know, there's landslides versus landslides, and we'll revisit that concept again. So, Washington State unstable slopes rules today. First of all, we try to avoid them. I mean, that's actually the first prescription. We try to find these things. There are a few more on the list, but intergorges and bedrock hollows are the two big ones. And it's the forest engineers that are out laying out harvest units have some training in how to identify these and how to put a paint buffer around them. And we just try to stay out of them. Now, obviously, there's some limitations to that. Sometimes there's timber on the other side and we have to get a road through them, or we have to yard through them. And so at that point, when you have to do an operation like that, you have to impact one of these rule identified landforms. Then you get to do a geotechnical assessment. And you get to go through a special, SEPA stands for State Environmental Policy Act. And so it's a special state level review. Still the same 30-day application process. It just got more scrutiny while it was being engineered by the company, more scrutiny as it goes through the 30-day review process. By and large, not really a big deal. And then in addition to that, the other thing we promised to do was road maintenance and abandonment plans. So this spun right out of the watershed analyses. Find some road problems in every watershed. There's too much surface erosion here. There's too many landslides there. We've got to do something. Landowner, come up with a plan. That's what the rule for this watershed is going to be. You need to make a plan. So we just planned for the first 6 years of the forest and fish rules. And then we had another 15 years to actually implement the work. And the plans were basically to upgrade the roads to some sort of reasonable standard with respect to cross drains and the sorts of BMPs that manage surface erosion before you haul on them, because obviously there's not a lot of point in doing that sort of effort after you haul. And then more slowly through time, we got all the fish barriers fixed. So fish are free to pass everywhere. And then we did some mitigation of landslide potential along the existing road network, and that can be careful additional cross drain locations. And it's also a process we call sidecast pullback, where we're actually identifying some short stretches with unstable fill and picking it up. So this is the harvest unit that I was supposed to finish running a report for my Forks office before I came to New Zealand. And I'm probably in hot water. The blue are buffers. The wider blue pieces down at the southern end and up in the far corner are actually fish buffers. So that's why that looks pretty substantive. The small blue patches are inner gorge buffers. And they're discontinuous because this hill slope is strongly benched. If you look at the contours, you can kind of pick that out, right? And so every time the channel cuts through the edge of a bench, it creates just a little piece of inner gorge. Kind of overkill probably to protect these when there's not bedrock hollows.
Oh, I never did.
Sort of the nuance we lost because we didn't have very many tools at the time. And the reason that this one's going SEPA is because there's 3 places, 2 of them are here, Reen, if you can find this. Okay, there's 3 places where we need a yarding corridor through one of these buffers. So at that point, I have to go, I have to see everything, I have to write about everything, and I have to justify the need for these yarding corridors and explain how much damage there's going to be and if we need any mitigation. By and large, these yarding corridors have not been causing a problem, so there's not a big fuss when these OPAs show up. And a lot of it at this point really feels like overkill, but along the way with my getting involved, there have been moments where we're talking about several yarding corridors, maybe something like downhill, side hill through something really nasty. We're just going to destroy the buffer under those conditions. And I'm like, whoa, can we think of something else? In some cases, we've just built a little bit more road a little further up the hill, gotten to a better landing position, not done that kind of damage to something. And so I think those conversations have been really worthwhile. You know, how can we avoid this problem? This is a little harder to see because I know it's hard to tell what we're going to cut and what we're not going to cut. But maybe right where the gray lines are all coming together. Okay, so that's a landing. And you can see what opens onto it down the ridges is all what we're going to cut. The funny little red pasture line is a small deep-seated landslide. We do worry about those, but a lot of them are very old. So we don't worry about them very much. We just kind of mention them. We say this is very old. We don't expect our forest practices to impact it. I had to, of course, talk about the yarding corridors where they're going through the buffers. This is a very complex piece of landscape, and we did lose between the fish buffers and the unstable slopes buffers quite a bit of the harvestable area. I will also mention that there's a natural gas line running through here. And not houses down in that lower valley, but not much further down valley. So there's maybe some reasons to be extra careful. So eventually our trees age out, but our 4 conifer species can live hundreds of years. 3 of them are shade tolerant, so there's an understory. coming up underneath. I mean, Douglas fir is not, but spruce and hemlock and cedar are all shade tolerant, so there's an understory coming up. We experience some blowdown in these buffers, more in the near coastal zone, less when you get over in the Cascades, but typically in the range of 10 to 25% of the trees blow down. But there's still, you know, big tree will provide support on the soil, limit activity. I will point out, you know, that this is our native forest. We are planting trees. We're running a plantation, but it's still a native species. And I think that does make a difference in the conversation. And then when we construct new road or rebuild really old road, which the Department of Natural Resources regulates exactly like constructing a new road. If you haven't been able to drive it for decades, it's new construction. You get in super steep ground and there's very complicated calls. I have probably looked at every inch of this 3 times. I've made all of these special calls about where we do end haul, where you can put some side cast over the edge, exactly where the cross drains have to go. Typically, if you're talking about long lengths of road construction, that's a separate FPA because it's just easier, you know, for all of us to process that way. Wanted to talk a little bit, how am I doing? Oh, not too bad. Not great. History of Oregon forest practices. I know less about the details, but it's only right now, more than 20 years after Washington went into the very first multi-landowner habitat conservation plan, that Oregon is headed that direction. I think they're getting pretty close to having it written. They have a long-standing public safety standard to review and mitigate for landslide potential. So, and a lot more public exposure, particularly in coastal Oregon. Washington, we've got big flat glacial surfaces, so you get out of the forested environment down onto a flat surface, and that's where people live. Not everywhere, but a lot of Washington. Oregon, you've got people in these real tight little coastal valleys. And so there were already some landslide protections for those reasons. Also that their road standards have been quite high for 20 plus years. So it's maybe not as big of a move into this habitat conservation plan. They're now talking about avoidance of the steepest, most unstable landforms, particularly in the context of if we get landslides there, we actually get wood in the channel, and we want wood in the channel because we don't tend to see the really dramatic wood residue problems that you have here. We want it for the fish habitat elements. And now that we've got complete LiDAR coverage, lots of landslide inventories, we're doing some pretty sophisticated modeling. So this is probability of initiation. And you can see that you're right up in those bedrock colors, and the steepest of them when you start getting orange and red colors, right? Really, really focused where we expect failures to initiate. This is probability of delivery, and it's very specifically tuned, not just sort of universal delivery to a channel, which is what we care about in Washington. This very specifically is delivery of the debris flow directly into fish water, so the wood comes with the sediment. And you see some nuance here, that stuff that wasn't the highest initiation probability does have a higher delivery probability. And you can combine the two of those and say, okay, so what is it I want to protect? Where is it I need my protections? You could tweak this different ways, but where Oregon's landing is they really want sort of the steepest, about 40%, that delivers right to fish water. And that will actually be a model on a map that we go lay out in the field. And New Zealand does look something like this. This is Green Ridge. It's about the first landslide I saw after we got out of the truck. And that is right in the middle of a big concave feature. That is exactly where the Oregon model would have predicted failure. And those are the failures that are going to make it into the system. So I have some thoughts about forest practices, roads and landings in New Zealand. It seemed like everywhere with high rainfall rates, roads are kind of all functioning the same. I don't see a lot of difference between Oregon, Washington, and even over here into New Zealand, and not so far all of New Zealand that I've seen. Roads are roads are roads. They have the same issues. They have the same solutions. Cross drains are good. One of my colleagues who retired a few years ago is famous for saying that she's never seen a road actually damaged for having too many cross drains. Pacific Northwest and New Zealand spacing requirements are very similar. We actually have a formula that says, okay, here's kind of maximum cross drain spacing, and we're going to bring it down in response to road gradient and geology. Yours are those curves that are by lithology, but the numbers end up being about the same. I would say that prior to the forest and fish rules in 2001, we'd been installing a lot of cross drains for 10 or 15 years before that. And I had to run some conversions, but people were still installing 300s and 375s. So we got to the forest and fish negotiations and said, okay, nothing smaller than 450. And every forest engineer in the state of Washington was unhappy with this. And there's not a forest engineer left in the state of Washington who would like to go back to smaller pipes. And it's really, once we got into the plastic era of pipes, the costs came down dramatically and aren't hugely different between the different pipe sizes. It's just that the maintenance on what we call an 18-inch is so much less. I got to read my own notes because I don't want to keep turning around and looking at the board. Using storm specs to size stream crossings is really good. We don't routinely do that in really small streams in Washington. We just kind of go, oh, well, it's a small stream. It's less than a meter, doesn't have fish. And we throw in maybe like a 600 or 660 or whatever your pipe size is, 24-inch. So it's really more specifically that we calculate for a 100-year storm reoccurrence for bigger channels that don't have fish, which doesn't actually end up being that many channels in Washington. And then when you have fish-bearing water, you're typically way oversizing pipes, right? The 100-year calculation may call for a 4-foot pipe, and you may be putting in a 7-foot pipe, and it's because we want, gravel beds so the little fishies can, take a rest while they're halfway through the pipe. Yeah, seriously. You end haul above 70%. You don't do much of anything special below about 50%. That and your numbers are 25 degrees and 35 degrees, but same. That all makes really good sense to me. And you're careful with both fill and wood residue near steep slopes and around landings. It's that 50 to 70% range. I just see some nuance in that, partly because of lithology, partly because of the climatic conditions that might hit an area. We do not do that funny little compacted terraced bench and stack part of our waste like that. We do haul it out, but then we've also got leeway to pick very specifically the places where we really expect a landslide that can deliver and maybe not worry about the other segments. So that's sort of a trade-off there. And I know that Reen's running a survey and working on, how is this benching working and how do we feel about it? If you're thinking about more consistent forest practices across the width and breadth of New Zealand, I have a few ideas. One of them is I really think that you need to separate sort of the subtropical from the temperate. People have been coming from New Zealand, Rayonier people, to the Pacific Northwest. I've had a few of them out on tours. They've been able to tell me how New Zealand is different. We have these wood residues, these big storms, all of a sudden, and they're almost describing like landslides of wood, right? And with very rare exception, I've not seen that process happen in Washington. So they've been able to tell me how New Zealand's different, but they have not been able to tell me why New Zealand is different. And north of, say, Napier, Hawke's Bay, that's fundamentally a subtropical climate. And you've got plate tectonic uplift, right? So you've got those very thin, raw, skeletal soils that just keep slipping off. And right there, just when you have really thin, clayey soils, they don't have much infiltration even when the rain first starts, so everything gets punched. And I think that the channels just charge up that much higher than you might expect looking at the channel, right? And then it's carrying a lot of wood downstream. And I'm not sure I've got the whole story, but I think that's part of the story. So I think that you need to characterize the types of slopes. And by that, I mean, you know, sort of slope gradient, curvature, proximity to the channels, where the wood residue is getting mobilized into the channel network. And that it's going to be management of those that's going to be, you know, critical in the context of community values. Now, in addition to that, and we had quite a bit of conversation about this, particularly the first couple of days when I was just with Rayonier people, about even where these little slips are not contributing wood or sediment to the channels. Up there in that subtropical environment, you're very routinely failing right down to bedrock. And it's going to be tough, right, to replant anything. I don't have answers to that, but I think it's fundamentally different than the more temperate soil profiles. When you're in the temperate environment, which I started seeing some signature of in the Hawke's Bay, Napier area, and certainly to the south, the soils are generally deeper. They weren't terribly deep in Napier, but a little deeper. And you're starting to get some kind of little humus layer on the top. And your infiltration and just your ability for rainfall gets slowed, it becomes shallow groundwater, and then it pops out in the channels, and that just sort of flattens the curve, right? So your precipitation may be a big spike, but your runoff in the channels is a flatter, controlled curve. I'm not sure where the dividing line is. If I was writing rules and having, you know, A and B, I don't know where that line is, but I think it probably has something to do with understanding if there's broader mobilization of wood residue outside of the channels into the channels. And if there's a point where that stops and you pretty much have to be right in the axis of the channel, axis of the landslide to entrain wood. And that's fundamentally, I think, going to be controlled by your soil depths and this infiltration process. So really south of this mythical line I'm hypothesizing about, a modeling effort, something similar to Oregon. Washington is actually in the process of doing research now headed in the direction that Oregon's gone. We've got LiDAR coverage. We can do much more nuanced landslide assessment and better understand where landslides are happening in somewhat different terrains. But you really, if you can do those things, then you can focus the policy conversation on what is it we want to protect? Where are those things? What do they look like? And once you're into the temperate soil climate, yeah, you've still got a lot of those little slips. Right? They're all over the place. There's even a few, you know, as nice as the Banks Peninsula is, I went out over the weekend and there's a few out there. But here where there's more soil depth, by and large, they're not failing to bedrock. There's still some dirt there. You're still going to be able to replant them. It can still be sheep pasture, whatever the process is. There's not a bare, slick bedrock surface. So I beg the question again, there's landslides versus landslides, right? So you see some really big ones. Right. Point to some of the big ones and they come all the way down the channel. Okay. And then you've got those very steep side slopes, but big planar side slopes. And there's some little slips, but they didn't make it. How much do we care about those? So I'd like to thank a wide cast of people for the opportunity to be in New Zealand, be here at the university, give some talks. Obviously, my employer, Rayonier, who's, you know, off and on talked about getting me over here for almost 25 years now. Forest Growers Research helped fund and organize this trip. Professor Rayonier, who has been putting up with me for many days over the last 2.5 weeks, and his graduate student, Simon Smith, spent quite a lot of time with me as well. Forest Enterprises and Era 2 Forests were our Gisborne field hosts, and got a big group together. We had some very interesting conversations out in the field. And then obviously the University of Canterbury faculty, staff, and students who have all been very welcoming. So thank you, guys.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much, Julie. I can certainly say that both being on your field trips or being part of the field trips, as well as have Julie lecture here to our students, we've certainly learned a lot from her as well. And I think part of the key messages is that Washington has really gone through that process maybe 30 years ahead of us, but they have simply also stepped through that process of dealing with your landslides, dealing with that regulatory environment, developing what they would be best management practices, with, for example, those rule-induced landforms, being able to identify those and manage those has been a really clear process. And so where Washington's at now is in a really good space in terms of a comfort zone, I guess, between industry and regulatory authorities, and long may that help us get to that particular point quicker than we're currently in the process for doing that now. I would like to open it up for questions.